Hello, I'm Reverend Barry Moultrie, and this is Mount Calvary Baptist Church, and we're so grateful to have an opportunity to sit and visit today. And I've got three of my closest friends here with me, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves in just a moment. But we want to have a conversation today on voting. We want to talk about the importance of voting in this moment and the relevance of voting, and especially for your state and local government positions and how important all of that is in our daily lives. Let's just take a moment and get introductions.
Well, thank you very much, Reverend Moultrie, for having me. My name is Craig Rice. I am a Montgomery County Council member, serving in my last term. This is my third term on the Montgomery County Council, and I also served a term in the Maryland House of Delegates for 4 years as well, from 2006 to 2010. Really happy to be here to talk about this. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Well, thank you. I guess we won't put you on the spot and ask you what next since you said this is your last term.
No, sir, I will not be able to answer that question today. We are talking about voting in this election.
Okay.
Good evening, Reverend Moultrie. My name is Lori Ann Sales, Council Vice President from the City of Gaithersburg. I am the first African American ever elected in the history of the city, the most diverse city in the country, and I am a proud member of Mount Calvary Baptist Church. Looking forward to the conversation and encouraging everyone to vote.
Good evening, Mount Calvary. Reverend Moultrie, thanks for having us all here today. My name is David Miles. I know I look a little weird without having the baby in tow, but she's walking now
And the harness.
has her own little bitty opinions and ideas. In addition to being a father, I serve as one of the 4 Rockville City Council members, and I'm happy to be here tonight to speak with you about the importance of voting. Thank you.
You also serve in uniform, right?
I was formerly in the United States Navy, yes, sir.
So you're no longer.
I'm reserves, unless there's World
You
War
still
III.
serve in uniform.
Yeah, I guess. Yes, sir.
And we thank you for your service.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I know that we've done our time in uniform, and we understand the value and the importance of that service. And as proud Americans, we understand that one of the most fundamental rights that we have is the vote. We understand that because we didn't always have that right
That's right.
in this country. Our ancestors bled and suffered and died so that we could have this right today. And yet we learn that there's so many that still won't vote. And just want to have a conversation about the importance of that and what can we possibly do to get more people to stand up and make their voice and their vote counted.
Well, this is also the 100th anniversary of a woman's right to vote. Not all women. It's also the 55th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, and so it wasn't that long ago that most of us couldn't vote, and how many sacrifices our ancestors had to make to ensure that we had a say in what happens in the government that oversees all of the resources and the planning for our communities. And so it really is puzzling that people take for granted this privilege that so many before us fought for. And so this year especially, I'm hoping that people reflect and they're going to the polls with that in mind, that it's not just about us, it's about the next generation and those who are going to benefit from the leaders that we elect to serve our communities.
You know, it's almost heartbreaking that you would say that this is the 100th anniversary of women's right to vote, and that right did not include women of color.
No.
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah.
It didn't include them, but yet we celebrate that.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
And we celebrate it because it's all a part of those baby steps that we had to take
Definitely.
to get to where we are right now. And within our church family to have 3 elected officials serving in such important capacities, we dishonor you and what you do if we don't use you, if we don't call upon you and make you aware of what's going on in our communities and in our church, if we don't ask you your opinions and for information to help guide us through this and navigate this, we devalue you. So I want to talk about it's too easy to talk about the national scene. Don't even want to touch that. But we know there are boards and commissions at the city level and at the county level. And we know that very few people on those boards and commissions and committees look like me, look like us. But those are policy-making boards and commissions.
That's right.
As are the councils. So critically important. Let's talk about, Councilman Rice, how we.
You know, it's one of those where you're right. It is disheartening when I hear people say that they decided not to vote. They didn't feel as though their vote mattered, and really don't understand what that vote truly means. Everything from making your voice heard at the census level and at the ballot box. Folks look at who are elected officials. And so then when it comes time for us to actually look at those particular neighborhoods, if you don't think that elected officials aren't looking at who are the ones who are speaking up, who are the ones who are making their voices heard come election time, it makes a tremendous difference. And so it's really one in which I wish that more people would understand just how impactful their vote truly is. Because the more folks that are out there that are putting their voice and what they want to see happen in their community out there for everyone to see, the more people will be responsive to the very needs that they have. Let me give you an example. If my folks in Montgomery Village don't vote, we have at-large members of the council, but yet we have folks in Tacoma Park or Silver Spring who do come out and vote. And they vote all the time in very large numbers. When it comes to where you're going to spend your time in the neighborhoods as you're preparing for re-election, what neighborhoods are you going to? Who are you going to ask, what are some of the issues that you care about that I need to focus on during my re-election? Those are the kinds of things that people forget about and don't understand just truly how much their voice matters. Not even just that, but let me just close with one last point on this. If we don't understand everything that our community needs, our community suffers as a result. The reality is there's no Rockville without Montgomery Village. There's no Montgomery Village without Damascus. There's no Damascus without Darnestown. There's no Darnestown without Germantown. We're all connected. We are all one big fabric. And you know, when you have one thread that's out of place, that garment is weaker.
Yeah.
We are stronger together when all of our voices are heard, when all of the things that matter in our community are addressed. That's what we need from our constituents. And we as elected officials can't get that from folks if they don't vote.
Yeah.
Something in what you just said that reminded me of this notion of participation, this notion that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, right? So being represented is very important,
Yes.
certainly from that perspective. I'm also mindful of perhaps the psychology of why people don't vote. Historically, there have been mountains of obstructions put in the way for people that look like us to keep us from voting, right? And it has morphed today into voter IDs laws that I experienced while even being active duty serving in North Carolina. They asked for my driver's license when I voted. To the ongoing disenfranchisement of our brothers and sisters that are incarcerated. There's one brother who mentioned there's something to be said when if you commit a felony and you come out, you have restricted access to housing, to get food, like, food stamps, and to vote. It's interesting that they put voting in there, right? He suggested that there's something important about that right to vote, that it was stripped from people who were charged with felonies. So that's the one side of it. But I'm inspired by groups of individuals, particularly African-American women who show up and show out and election after election, and who fought despite, as my colleague said, it's the 19th Amendment was ratified some 100 years ago, but it was members of your very own organization, so I won't say much more, who actually really put in the work to allow us to vote. So I'd be interested in I know you know the history.
Oh, yes, yes. The sorors of Delta Sigma Theta were definitely on the front lines of the women's suffrage movement. They weren't always recognized, but they were definitely there. And actually was it 2013, they did the March on Washington, and the Deltas led the procession. So it goes to show you that history may not always repeat itself if we do what we're supposed to do. And I'm glad you brought up the fact of people who are incarcerated and them not coming out and getting full restoration of their right to vote. And it is interesting that if people don't want you to have access to something, if it's so important, if your voice really didn't matter, why would they keep it from you?
That's right.
And if we're talking about local elections and we're seeing the hashtags that have plagued our entire timeline this summer, from George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, it's the state's attorneys that bring charges, the state's attorneys that we elect. It's the judges that put away our brothers and sisters and do these long sentences. The Board of Education right now and the County Council, they're both looking at, should we have school resource officers in our school? We saw the Office of Legislative Oversight put forth a report earlier this year that talked about the over-policing of Black and brown youth. And so when you think about all of these policies, I want to remind my young brothers and sisters, we cannot just protest in the streets. We have to take that protest to the ballot box so we can turn those protests into policy-making decisions and put the right people in office to make the decisions for our residents. And so if we don't vote, we cannot complain, and things are not going to change with hashtags. They only change when new laws are created, and it takes people who have values, shared values, that are going to bring about the change in the types of communities that we want to see in our future. And it's only going to happen if we show up.
Yeah. So you just mentioned the judges, and I really need to bring this point up. Didn't think about it, but this is the moment. I hosted not very long ago a forum with the Lincoln Park Historical Foundation, and we interviewed the circuit court judges that are on the ballot this year. All 5 of them that are on the ballot, and as well as the one that's a write-in candidate. And I asked the question, I talked about an article I'd read recently in a newspaper about a young man in a different state that 23 years ago was tried, convicted of stealing a pair of hair clippers, less than $100 value, 23 years ago. And yet he's up for parole again this year and was denied parole. He's been incarcerated for 23 years for stealing a pair of hair clippers. And so I asked the question of these candidates who hope to sit on the bench that will be judging our children and even us if fates turn that way. And the question was, we know that the police put cases together after they investigate, and they submit that to the state's attorneys, who then decide whether or not to prefer charges, and they bring those into the courtroom. And the judges sit and adjudicate these cases and then pass sentences. After that's done, once a person is locked away, the parole board makes decisions about whether or not they get out. But then when we find a case that is so absurdly wrong, and we look back, is there not something that from the bench a judge could have done to stop this? And these judges almost to a person, said that we don't make the law. We simply interpret and adjudicate. And if the law is bad, if none of this works for us, how do we ever get to a place of equal justice under the law? As elected officials, what can we do? We've just been put between a rock and a hard place in this. What can we do to try to help figure this out?
So let me just jump in there because that's something that I think that we on the Montgomery County Council tried to tackle last year under the leadership of a woman of color, Nancy Navarro, who was our council president, who led us to pass the racial equity and social justice lens that now is everything that we do in Montgomery County has to be evaluated with a racial equity and social justice lens. We also have a brand new racial equity and social justice office, including a racial equity and social justice officer who leads that, Tiffany Ward. We have done a complete 360 in progressive Montgomery County in terms of understanding the impact of the laws that we pass and what they do primarily to our people of color and our people of lower socioeconomic status, something we have never done before.
I'm sorry, I need to interrupt you because I really have to ask this question. Are you saying to us, I just need to translate because I don't know if I fully understood what
Sure.
you said. Are you saying to us that there is a racial equity and social justice office and officer, and if we feel that there's some impropriety, something that happened that should not have happened that way, we have some place that we can go and file petition and ask to have this reviewed, even if it happened in the courts?
Yes, to a certain extent, but this is more of perspective.
Okay.
So this is more for things that are moving forward. So any single law, any single zoning text amendment that we pass, all of our budget items will all be evaluated on this racial equity and social justice lens. However, if there are existing policies, if there are things that are currently ongoing right now that we feel as though, or people in the community feel as though, aren't up to snuff in terms of us making sure that we are protecting our people of color and people of different socioeconomic statuses, then they will look at those things as well. Now, when you're talking about judgments, it's a completely different thing, and one in which I think that working with our court system, obviously, we're going to have to do more when it comes to those folks that are incarcerated. I represent Clarksburg, which is our jail. It's not a prison, so we don't have folks with long sentences that are there. But even the folks who are incarcerated at Clarksburg, we still have concerns there too about how those folks ended up there and why we see primarily young men of color, primarily African American, is the major component of who's in Clarksburg jail, when that is not the large makeup of Montgomery County as a whole. And so when you see that disparity, what Councilmember Sales was talking about, when it comes to those same sort of disparities that we see in interactions with our police, in any kind of disciplinary procedures in our schools, there is a connection there. And there certainly is a line in which we have to make sure that we're understanding that, break some of those pipelines that are there, and ensure that those folks who are wrongfully given long sentences that are well beyond what they were intended to be for the types of crimes, really are things that I think we have some more work to do, especially when it comes to our judicial system.
Any thoughts you want to add to that? I've got a few more questions I want to throw out, but
Yeah, I think the question and the response brought up for me a number of related topics, taken from things that you mentioned before in terms of protests and how do you deal with the frustration of a situation that is unfair and unjust, be it police brutality or a number of other laws that are in place that keep us from realizing our full potential. I'm thinking back to the protests and uprising that occurred in Ferguson, Missouri following the murder of Michael Brown. People were upset and rightfully so, but it just didn't end with the protest or the hashtag. They went on to triple the representation of African Americans in city council in Ferguson as a result. now they can change the very police practices that perhaps contributed to Michael Brown's murder. One of those protesters who herself was homeless, victim of domestic violence, is a nurse, and probably going to win the U.S. Congress seat.
Wow.
And so it's this notion of how you turn your frustration into action, to realizable action. And I think there's a net connection and continuum there. And again, I'm just so inspired by really women. I think too often in our discussions about the Voting Rights Act or civil rights more broadly, we have these, we lionize figures, and rightly so. There are a number of great leaders, but it was, the Ella Bakers who were, holding up the front and training the new leaders to come thereafter, the young leaders that went on to bring even more change. So I'm inspired. I am rightfully concerned about some of the obstacles that stand in the way, but I'm super inspired by our young people, and I'm hopeful that they can translate, as was mentioned earlier, that passion and that anger into real change. And it's happening even here in Montgomery County, at the county council level, at our neighboring jurisdictions level, and we just need folks to continue to push us to make sure we do the right thing by you all.
Recently I was on a Zoom call. That's what we do these days. We spend our days on Zoom with a group of folks, and there was another clergy person on there that said, "Thank God we're not Louisville right now." And I found myself just in that moment overly heated and outraged, because the truth of the matter is we are Louisville.
Mm-hmm.
Every city, county, municipality in this country right now is Louisville. And we find out even, I think just today, that the charge of murder was taken off the table for that one police officer.
Chauvin. Mm-hmm.
That's the one in Minneapolis with George Floyd.
Yes.
It was taken off the table. And for the life of me, I don't understand.
Mm-hmm.
It baffles me how any municipality can feel like we're removed from this. We all are one breath away, one mishap, one moment away from this powder keg erupting even in our neighborhood.
Let me just say this. Folks have to understand that just as we declared, my good friend, Councilmember Will Jawando, led the effort in us declaring racism a public health emergency. Racism exists everywhere.
Yeah.
We are not immune from that in Montgomery County, not immune from it in Gaithersburg or Rockville, not immune from that in this church or anywhere else. The reality is that racism exists everywhere. And so from that perspective, it is important for us to acknowledge that and to then strive to get better. And if we pretend that we are better than another jurisdiction because we may not have those really egregious sort of things happening all the time, just talk to a person. Talk to them about their experience growing up here in Montgomery County. Ask a young black man about his experiences growing up here in this county. Ask me.
Ask me.
Ask a young Latino about their experiences as they grew up here in this county. Ask a young woman of color about her experiences at schools and what people would say to them versus say to their white counterparts, and how they would treat them differently. These are all things that we see around us, but yet we somehow pretend as though we're better than someone else because we don't have a George Floyd that died in the street. We don't have a Michael Brown that got choked out. We don't have those kinds of things that are happening in our streets, and so therefore we're okay. That's not true. And it's the reason why, again, people need to lift up their voices by voting. They need to make sure that they tell their stories. They need to make sure that they're talking to their elected officials about the things that matter to them, their experiences, what they'd like to see change. The only way that we can get better, the only way that we can live up to that commitment of being that better place for everyone and eliminating racism is by them voting, by them having their voice tied directly to the people who lead them. And us, their local elected officials, are the ones who are making those changes more quickly than anybody else who's elected. It is all at the local level. And it's one of those that you started off at the beginning when you talked about. We can talk about the national level and the president, but the reality is, even with the president and some of the challenges we may have with some of his policies, the reality is that we affect more of everyone's daily life every single day than the president ever will.
And you can probably get us on the phone any day of the week.
There you go. That's right.
More so than any of our federally elected officials. And so if we're going to talk about policymakers and putting the right people in office at the local level, I just saw an article about House Speaker Adrienne Jones, the first African-American woman to be House Speaker in the state of Maryland. The Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights was created in our state, like so many other things that were created in this state, from slavery and how we are going to overturn that. I don't think anyone would have the courage or the forethought to even think to introduce this sort of legislation at this time were it not for who we have leading the House of Delegates. And so it's going to be a very, very interesting upcoming General Assembly session, and that's only because there's a new crop of delegates and senators in Annapolis that are going to bring forth a lot of changes, much needed changes, that are definitely going to impact how we legislate back home at the local level, the things that we are going to be looking at. The conversation's definitely changing, and it's only because there's different people, it's more diverse voices and perspectives at the table.
Interesting. So I need to ask this question, and I know we're going a little bit longer than I anticipated, and I apologize for that. But you guys are our elected officials. You're ours in more ways than one. It's not just because you won the election and you hold that office, but you're ours because you look like us. You represent us not as our legislators, but you represent us as people. And so I know that you are there to represent all of the people of your districts, all of the people of the city or the county. How many people come to you in phone, email, whatever form, and say, you are my elected official and I need for you to hear this and address this, deal with that? How many people do that? And then the challenge is, of those people that do that, how many of them are people of color? Do we participate? I mean, it's one thing to get people to come out and vote, but then to participate in the process, to hold those officials accountable, to help steer them and guide them into the things that matter in our communities and in our lives. How many people do that for you?
That's a great question. I love my people. I mean, we don't like to criticize each other in public, right? And there's reason for that. There are very few of us out there. So I understand the reluctance to be as critical as we perhaps should be in fighting for our own interests, in holding elected officials that look like us to task. But I argue that's the only way you're going to make us better. You have to hold us accountable. I appreciate the support and the vote, but as you know, our county council member said, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. So if they're really, sending the emails, calling you on the phone, those individuals, those constituencies tend to get more of your attention. It is incumbent upon us, though, to remember where we came from and not take, your support for granted. So I encourage folks all the time, hold me accountable, hold me to task. If I'm not doing right, pull my coat. My mom still does, so I mean, you can too. And I'm very serious about that. I think it's important. The only other point I want to touch on is the obvious point, is to really do your homework with regard to the selection. Yes, the presidential race is on the ticket, but it's all the stuff, the so-called down ballot stuff. And many of you have probably received your ballots in mail. It's like two and a half pages. Please fill it out to the end. Please do your research. I'll admit, I had to go on the internet to look up some stuff about some of the judges, right? I mean, that's real. Take the time to do the research, because it matters. The people, as Reverend Moultrie correctly pointed out, that adjudicate, these cases if they come before the court of judges. The people who, for example, I was running late tonight because we're setting up a police citizen review board. That's happening at the local level. That's not, I guess it's William Barr's our Attorney General. That's not him doing, that's us right here. So these races are important. I'm not saying that out of self-promotion, but it's important. It's important to whether your snow gets shoveled, your garbage gets taken out, and if the police treat you right. So please vote. Please hold us accountable.
I guess I should have pointed out from the beginning, and I apologize for that, but none of these are on ballots this year. They're not up for election or re-election. They came to sit and have a conversation. And I hope in our next conversation we can dig into some other matters that I think you guys have put on the table that I'd really like to dig into. But I want to tell you a little bit of a story before we go. Several years ago, in uniform in the United States Air Force in Germany, I had the pleasure of being a part of a detail that was escorting then U.S. Senator Strom Thurmond. And he said to me at one point, do you realize, now we all know that Strom is one of the most racist figures in the history of our country. And he was being a little cynical of something that I had already asked him. But he said, do you realize that in the last presidential election, less than 11% of the United States military bothered to vote?
Wow.
And he says, I'm going to take you a little bit further than that. He said, of those that bothered to vote, do you realize that less than 1% of them has ever in their history bothered to write a letter to their elected officials? You folks don't care what happened to y'all, so why should we? That stung me. That hurt me. And I purpose from that point on that the people that represent me are going to hear from me. They're going to know what matters to me. And we all need to do that. I look at our council, our county council. This is your last term. I believe this is Nancy Navarro's last term as well. Right. And so after this term, in its current configuration, there will be one person of color on that council.
Two.
Oh, Gabe Albanos.
Gabe, I'm sorry, yes. I just sat with him, I'm sorry, I should forget that. But no females.
That's right.
What does that say for our future? Who do you see down line that could be stepping up, that should be stepping up? What can we do to help prepare people and get people engaged?
That's the reason why I think that people need to get engaged, as David and Lori were both saying, and have their voices heard beyond protests in the street. It goes further than that. And I'll share with you just a very quick personal story about me, as I advocated for my Germantown community when my wife and I first moved there and she was pregnant, and wondered why it was that we didn't have a hospital in Germantown. And Germantown was the most populous place in Montgomery County at the time with 80-some thousand residents. Now it's over 100,000 residents. And I said to myself, why is that? Why do I have to drive all the way down to Gaithersburg to an emergency hospital at Shady Grove? That's concerning. And so I joined this group called the Germantown Alliance, and we became this force for saying we wanted to see something happen and brought the Shady Grove Emergency Center to Germantown. That was right before I then ran for office. And seeing that happen, I said to myself, it's great to advocate, but it's another thing to be the one actually making the decision. Those decisions about hospitals were made at the state level, and so I ran for the Maryland House of Delegates. They also dealt a lot with education policy, which I care about a lot, being the son of a former teacher. But I will tell you, that's what we need to see from our community. So many people are stuck in that place of being the protester and not then translating that into being the leader. So when I talk to young kids and ask them about what they want to be, I insist that someone has to consider being an elected official. The unfortunate thing, and the reason why I think that a lot of people don't vote, is because such a negativity has grown around the ideology of politics and the separation that somehow it's not God-fearing, somehow that it's not legitimate, somehow that it involves corruption. Those kinds of things are keeping us, the people, from truly having control over our own government. And those people who then are making those decisions are making them for their own best interests and for the best interests of their friends. And I can say that because I've been in politics a long time, and I've seen folks who do it well and folks who don't do it well at all and could care less, just like Strom Thurmond said to you, about the people that they represent. So the choice is yours. Do you want to be one of those who is run over by folks, or do you want to be the person who's deciding what's going to happen in your community? That's what this is about. That's what elections are for, to make sure that people hear you and understand the impact that you can have on your community.
I see you. I hear you. Those are important things. And we need to make sure that those people that represent us see us, they hear us. We have to get out and vote.
Yes.
We have to take charge of that portion of our destiny that God placed in our hands. I don't know, Louis B. Gates isn't here, and I don't know my ancestry, just like I'm sure most of you don't know yours. But I imagine that some of my ancestors went to the polls years ago and were told to guess how many jelly beans are in a jar, or were asked some other ludicrous question, or were beaten, and some even died. I feel that if I don't vote, I'm desecrating that legacy. I don't know what you feel, but I hope you feel a sense of obligation. Vote like your life depends on it, because it does. Thank you for listening. God bless you. We thank you all for your time and attention, and I hope we can get together again real soon. This has been fun for me.
It was.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Reverend
you so
Moultrie.
much.
Thank you, church family.
Yes. Thank you, Mount Calvary. Thank you, Reverend. This was excellent.